Well, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very honored, and I hope I don't bore you, um, and I hope I get through my presentation. Much of what I'm going to talk about is largely trying to explain, at least often what I'm trying to explain to policymakers, is something that they don't like to hear, and that is that the trade policies that they negotiate often have an impact on trade but not as big of an impact on trade as they think. And so we have to look at trade in a much broader context, and we have to understand the forces that drive trade growth. And so trade policymakers are often focused very much on the tariff cuts that they negotiate or the streamlining of non-tariff measures that they negotiate either at a bilateral, regional, or multilateral level. And what most research has found is that what explains most trade growth is more macroeconomic forces, GDP growth, okay? And that trade costs often change, particularly fall, for reasons unrelated to their policy negotiations, okay? Technological change and things like that. So I'm going to make this case, and then I also want to talk a little bit, to the extent that I can, about the future of trade, okay? And put up some hypothetical stuff I did a few years ago that we're working on revising and updating for our next World Trade Report, which will come out in September, on the future of trade, particularly how digitally enhanced technology might affect trade, okay? So, you know what? This is right in between my eyes' ability to read. uh, all right. I should be able to do this without reading anything. So a lot has happened in the last 35 years. So this is another construct that I'm going to try to use on occasion in this presentation. What happened in the last 35 years? And to basically argue that the next 35 years are going to be different. And the previous 35 years were different than the previous 35 years before then, okay? So part of the challenge at a place like the WTO is for me anyway, is to get trade negotiators to look out the windshield, the front window of the car, rather than in the rear view mirrors to see what's going on behind them, okay? And I'll come back to that point. So a couple of high-level things. During what's called the long 1990s, we had a period of amazing integration. You experienced it here in Germany directly, integrating Eastern Germany, okay? The opening up of the Central and East European countries and to some extent Russia. China opening up. India opening up. Lots of unilateral liberalization that had a huge impact on the world supply of labor, opportunities for capital and investment to flow into regions of the world that were pretty far behind the global technology frontier, as well as the WTO and the Uruguay round and previous trade rounds before that, lots of regional trade agreements. So it was really a very exceptional period. There was rapid trade growth and integration. But most importantly is the third bullet up here. The best measure of trade growth suggests that openness policies accounted for roughly 25% of that trade growth. Okay? So of that rapid trade growth, only about 25% of it had to do with these proactive liberalization, whether unilateral, multilateral, regional. And that's pretty important. But most of the growth was due to fundamental and reasonably synchronized macroeconomic growth, falling trade costs for reasons other than policy negotiations, and technology. More recently, until this past year, trade growth had been very slow for the last 4 or 5 years, right? And everybody's like, well, you know, it's because of protectionist measures. And a friend of mine, Simon Evanet, at St. Gallen often argues that there's this murky protectionism and that these things are causing the trade slowdown that we experienced in the last 5 years. And my argument was, no, I don't think so. We don't see trade costs rising very much as a result of that. It's more macro, and I think I hopefully will make the case that indeed it has been more macro. We've had macro synchronization in 2017, where growth around the world started to synchronize and increase, and we've seen recovery in trade growth. So that's the trade growth has been slow, fundamental macro factors, uncertainty, all right? And the recovery this year, despite all the rhetoric, but now risks are pretty high. So the spring meetings just occurred in Washington, and there was a lot of rhetoric around concerns that a trade war could derail the current economic recovery. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, or remind me if I don't to come back to that. I would argue that despite all the rhetoric, the direct costs of the tariff measures that have been brought up in the press, and I use that term very carefully, brought up in the press, because many of them have not been applied yet, okay, that direct effect, if you look at a partial equilibrium model, these are small, and they're not likely to have a significant impact on economic growth. We did some CGE analysis, and it's like 1/20%, the direct effect. Okay? But the indirect effects and the knock-on effects could be much greater. So if uncertainty rises, or there's a lot more counter actions, if the trade war truly turns into action rather than rhetoric, then we could see some significant effects. It's important to keep in mind that if these protectionist measures go into effect, there will be a lot of shifting of trade across sectors and across countries. Okay? The longer term, let's say a country like the United States, let's say it aggressively pursues trade protectionism and sustains it for a long time, then I would argue that it's going to hinder its long-term growth capability. It's going to fall below the global frontier, where it's usually at the global frontier, and the long-term costs could be very significant. But that's speculative. You know, we'd have to have some time pass to take a look at that. So this is some earlier work done by Dennis Novi, who looked at trade costs between the U.S. and some major trading partners between 1970 and 2000. And, sorry about that. And then down here on the left is the U.S. average tariff from the U.S. ITC. And if you look here, if I can figure this out. Excuse me for, there we go, just as you get up here. So this blue line here is total, the tariff on total imports. The orange line here is on dutiable imports. So a lot of the US tariff lines are duty-free. So the average tariff is very low. And this is 1970, I believe, right in here. Yeah, wow, I can't read that at all. Yeah, right here is 1970. So it was about, on dutiable imports, it was about 10% in 1970, and it's dropped to about 5%. Okay? So that's 5 percentage point drop on the average US tariff. Whereas if you look at Novi's work up here, now I gotta find it again, you can see that the overall tariff equivalent of US bilateral trade costs has dropped by between 38 and 44%, much bigger than 5 percentage points. Okay, and if you look at total growth in U.S. bilateral trade, the contribution of income to total trade growth here, you know, averages in the 60s to 70%. So GDP growth seems to be a much bigger explanatory variable in Novi's work, gravity work, or inverse gravity work, compared to tariff changes. And then the bilateral trade costs make up this, this portion here. And then you have this multilateral resistance term, which basically says that its overall trade costs have been declining by some relatively small percentage points, but something to be considering. Now, between 1980 and 2014, by the way, that's gravity work. I'm going to come to some work by the IMF and then some work that we've done that have broken out import demand and basically looked at driving factors for it and reinforced, come into a very similar estimate as the gravity work. So this is some World Bank chart. It's from a publication they did on the Rising South about Latin America. And on the vertical axis, we have similarity in trade structure, and on the horizontal axis, we have systemic relevance in global trade. So how important are you in terms of a driving force by some complex measure in global trade? In 1980, this small group of countries, which include Europe and the United States, were by far the most systematically important countries in the world. And if you recall, in 1980, the US was very concerned about trade relations with Japan, right? And negotiated voluntary export restraints with Japan, which many economists argue helped Japan much more than it helped any US industry, and it cost US consumers a lot, right? But it's pretty clear that the US was negotiating with Japan, which was one of these systematically important countries, by the way. But unfortunately, these lines don't show the thickness of the trading relationship, but it was a pretty thick relationship between the US and Japan. And in a sense, this could be suggesting that the US had market power, and Japan was worried about that market power, okay? Now, one might argue that Japan also had some pricing power in the US market. But look at the world in 2014. This whole distribution here is shifted to the right in terms of systemic relevance. Many more countries are very important in global trade. China is more important than the US out here. And you have many countries starting to fill in this middle area, which was a gap here. So I read this as suggesting that trade partners have other options, other choices, other countries they can trade with. Recently, Mexico and the EU announced that they were close to an agreement, right? They haven't quite nailed it down, but that they were close to an agreement. TPP went ahead without the US. So, and Canada signed the CETA agreement with the EU. So it's pretty clear to me that there's a much more diverse set in the global economy for countries to trade with. The US is still very important, but nowhere near as important as 1980. My fear is that the current administration in the United States may be thinking the world is still 1980. Okay? But it's not. It looks much more like this. Okay? I don't need to make this point here. Some places I do. But there's a really strong positive correlation between trade and economic growth. And we see that in a lot of the data in many ways. But this is arguing that trade has been a positive contributor to economic growth, not that economic growth is a contributor to trade. We still haven't been able to sort that argument out, okay? But the correlation is pretty high. The opposite, if you look at growth and countries that raise protection, then you get a discernible negative effect of protection on economic growth, okay? Here it's hard to sort out what the causality is, but generally we would argue that there's very strong correlation and that countries that are growing fast do seem to engage in trade more actively than countries that don't grow fast. It's also highly correlated with a big decline in poverty. So, what is slow trade growth? Let me see, I think the next. All right. So, this is a chart of what we call the trade elasticity, which is the relationship between trade growth and economic growth, the percentage change in trade growth to the percentage change in economic growth. This period right here is the long 1990s, where you see that elasticity going above 2 pretty frequently, and the average elasticity there suggests that trade grew twice as fast as GDP. Except for this recovery here after the great financial crisis, we had this long period here of 5 years where trade growth was about equal to GDP growth or a little bit slower than GDP growth. And this is called the slow growth period. And there was a very significant concern that we were moving from this period to this period, from high growth, twice as fast, to only as fast or a little bit slower. And as I mentioned to you, in 2017 we had a recovery, and so far in 2018 trade is going pretty strongly. And this 1.5 and 1.4 figure is really what the long-term relationship. So if you go back to the 1960s, actually Doug Irwin has gone back to the 1800s, and if you calculate the long-term relationship between trade and GDP, it's much more around 1.5 and 1.4. And what that suggests is that this period was pretty unusual, and that's that integration, right? Large swaths of the global economy opening up. And that this may be a much more realistic expectation going forward if we don't have large opportunities for opening up. Maybe Africa is the next continent. There's a lot of work that could be done in South America, but that's a pretty fragmented policy environment. All right, so that's the slow trade growth. So what's caused the slow trade growth, and this is recent work, I think 2 years ago by the IMF, OECD, work that we did, European Central Bank, UBS, WIOD, University of Groningen. Lots of people have looked at this, and we think that it's very important to look at the import-adjusted demand intensity. So for GDP growth, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, okay, that you need to pay attention to how much trade intensity there is in each of those components. And what you find, if you set exports aside, because it turns out, as you may have heard, often you import to export. So exports are very import intensive, but let's set the trade elements aside. Investment is very, very trade intensive. So if investment is weak, it's going to have a knock-on effect on trade. Consumer durables are very trade intensive. If demand for consumer durables is weak, then trade, that's going to undermine global trade growth. So that we find that investment, particularly for machinery and equipment, and C for consumer durables, that it's very trade intensive. Interestingly, G is the least trade intensive by far. And that makes sense because a lot of government expenditures are on non-tradable services, right? They may spill over indirectly. If you're giving direct payments to consumers, you know, that may spill over into some of the trade-related goods. But the direct effect is pretty low. There is quite a difference across development level. So developed versus developing, there's a geographical distribution of these intensities. So the rule holds that investment tends to be most trade intensive, and then consumers, particularly consumer durables, but the level of that intensity varies by your level of development, but also in some cases by your by the geography that you're locked into. There's been some debate about the role of GVCs. So initially, when the trade slowdown happened, there was a lot of concern that GVCs are contracting, that they're in retreat, and our research suggests that they're not growing as fast as they used to, but that they're not in retreat, okay? That they've kind of stabilized, maybe a slight downturn, but they're not, that doesn't seem to be a significant player in the trade slowdown. The lack of continued liberalization, this loss of momentum, has been important. But again, it's about 25%. It explains about 25% of the trade slowdown. Now, if you think into the future, if you want to stimulate trade, and you think that trade, as I do, trade has positive impacts on economic growth, that 25%, from a historical perspective, may be more important going forward if you don't get the fast growth from opening up large swaths of the global economy from that unusual integration that we had. What we don't see when we look at either straightforward calculated measures of trade costs, tariffs, or gravity work, we don't really see these protectionist measures, although Simon has generated some estimates to suggest, particularly for Europe, that there has been an effect. But globally, we don't see a big effect from these things. I'm not saying you ignore them, but if you focus on them as the explanatory driver for the trade slowdown, you're missing a big part of the story. Okay. Now, a little bit, trade's role in growth. I would argue that the direct effects are these short-term efficiency gains, the deadweight loss triangles that many economists spend time trying to measure out there, keeping in mind that the political economy is around the trapezoids or the rectangles, around producer surplus and consumer surplus. That's what policy folks are negotiating all the time. That's what Trump is after. I want more producer surplus, more revenues for producers of steel and aluminum in the United States. And that's going to largely come from consumers, so that's a redistribution, and it's going to also come from the upstream industries, right? Users of steel and aluminum are going to lose producer surplus. So there's this much bigger redistribution effect, but we focus typically on the deadweight losses, the short-term efficiency gains. I would argue that those depend on the level of the distortions being removed. Okay, so are they big? Are they big tariffs? I ran into this when I was with the United States International Trade Commission. Congress, the pro-traders in Congress and the anti-traders in Congress, and USTR always wanted much bigger effects from our trade agreements than our estimates generated. And the issue is that most of the gains were coming from deadweight loss triangles disappearing, and they were very small in the United States because tariffs are very low in the United States. Okay? Now, the long-term gains, and by the way, if you're a large country, you're less susceptible to concerns because you can shift production. You've got a wider variety of productive capability than if you're a small country like Norway and you depend on a lot of imported goods because you don't have a very diverse economy. Okay, so if you're a diverse economy and large, then these trade effects, they're still positive, they're still worth pursuing, particularly if you're having slow growth for other reasons, but they're not going to be life-changing overall for the underlying growth rate. Long-term efficiency and productivity gains, I think, are far more important. OECD research has told us that openness leads to faster productivity growth, and that productivity growth, particularly in an era of slow productivity growth, underlying slow productivity growth, is very, very important. And I've talked about the opening up of various regions. Yeah, and I don't think that we're going to see a reproduction of the long 1990s anytime soon. I'm going to skip this because this is more about what's happening with trade recently. But I think the important thing to take away is that you can see that developing countries, those are the green lines here, have been experiencing much faster growth in exports than developed countries. okay? That's the red line. And the same with imports, although they were very significantly affected in 2015, and that's largely the commodity boom bust, right? And particularly Latin American commodity exporters having a significant drop in revenues, investment fell through the floor, import demand fell through the floor. So again, macro issues. And I would also argue that the developing countries are the ones that are furthest away from the global frontier. And so a lot of the GVC investment is helping to give them much faster dynamic growth by shifting out their production possibility frontier towards the global frontier. So this isn't just them liberalizing and removing tariffs. They've got a much bigger dynamic effect. That liberalization is important to get that investment, okay? But the investment is having a bigger effect, direct effect, than the liberalization. Right now, there's this broad-based recovery in trade, and that's been relatively unusual. So my boss, Roberto Acevedo, has been very frustrated. I've been at the WTO for 4 years, and until this year, I've had to go in there and say, trade growth has been really slow, Roberto. And he's like, why? I want it to be faster. And I'm like, well, lots of people want it to be faster, but we have to wait till there's a global recovery and all pistons in the engine are firing in sequence. And what we observed in that 4 or 5 year period was those pistons, the US would do well, Europe would do bad. And then maybe Europe would start to recover along with the US, and then Asia would have a slowdown, or South America, and then the US would have a slowdown. We had this very uneven growth. Now we're back to synchronized growth, which is a wonderful place to be, and I had good news for him this year, and he was very happy with that news. Although I would argue, you don't want fast trade growth just for fast trade growth, right? You want trade to grow as fast as the fundamental underlying economic needs of the market are. An interesting aspect here is this red line. That's South America. And you can see that these are in volumes, by the way. Okay, so no price effects here. You can see that they tried to maintain export volumes, but import volumes fell because the underlying value of these export volumes fell significantly because prices for commodities fell significantly. So they had to reduce their demand, their import demand. So this gives you some idea of the range of import content of investment for selected economies from 1995 to 2014. This green line is Germany. So Germany had a pretty big increase from 1995 to about 2004 in the import intensity. A slight decline in 2000, but that's a pretty good rate of increase. But then its import intensity in investment has stabilized. China had a rapid increase and is now in decline in terms of its import intensity and investment. And this is going to be very important for the future of trade, I think. You have two things happening. The import intensity of investment in China is declining, largely because they're now producing more of the parts and components domestically that they used to import from other Asian countries and from Europe and the United States. But at the same time, investment growth is slowing. So you get a double whammy. You get slower investment in China, and you get a decrease in the import intensity in China. And we think that's going to have a big impact on the future of trade. Now, at the same time, consumption is growing faster in China than it did before. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the import intensity in Chinese consumption changes, right? Or how it's going to evolve. Are they going to consume more non-tradable services and those kinds of goods? Or are they going to become much more of a consumer-oriented economy and buy more white goods and automobiles and things of that nature? What we expect is that, and you'll see in some of the future-related stuff that I put up here in a few minutes, that could have a big impact on global trade. If China starts being a big importer compared to being a big exporter to meet that increase in consumer demand, and resources have to shift from the manufacturing sector to the services sector. This happened in the United States, right? So in the United States, there's been a big shift of capital and labor away from manufacturing and into services, non-tradable services. Michael Spence has talked about this. We could see something like that happening in China very quickly, right? And so it'll be very interesting to see how much of that shift in consumer demand goes to these consumables that are trade intensive versus non-tradable services. And you can see the United States, the pattern there has been somewhat stable with variation, and Japan's investment intensity and investment has been going up. Yeah, I'll leave that one behind. Yeah. So last year, we did our World Trade Report on trade, jobs, and technology. And our goal was to try to separate out the effects of trade and technology on the employment market in the United States, but elsewhere also. It's very hard to do, right? Because I have a chart in here, a graph a little bit later that shows how hard it is to separate out the effect of trade and technology, because we often consider trade importing somebody else's technology. But this shows in the United States, and we can put up lots of charts like this that show a very similar pattern where the share of manufacturing employment in total employment has been dropping very significantly across the developed world. Meanwhile, the blue line here is manufacturing share of real GDP. So we see that manufacturing share of real GDP in the United States has stayed pretty constant, while the manufacturing employment share has declined very significantly. If you blow this section up right here, then you get, whoops, sorry. If you blow this up, you get this decline right here will look very, very significant. And so you'll see China joining the WTO in 2000 is associated with a rapid decline in employment in U.S. manufacturing. But if you look at it from a much longer term perspective, okay, you see a long-term decline, and that change doesn't look anywhere near as significant as if you focus on that period by itself. Now, I will tell you that the empirical work will show that China opening up and joining the WTO, that's a statistically significant and important explanatory variable there. But you've got to look at it in the context of the global share of employment in the United States manufacturing, long-term trend downward, and that's largely technology, okay? I already talked about this. So one of the big challenges that happened in the United States as a result of that decline, and particularly around the period of in 2000, is that the margins of adjustment became much more important. And whereas when the U.S. signed NAFTA, its labor market did not seem to be significantly negatively affected. The underlying labor market institutions seem to work to help with adjustment. What we've found since the 1980s, and this goes into this changing world in the last 35 years, is that particularly in the US, but not only the US, labor market institutions are being challenged. And government policies are also being challenged. And if you are not thinking about your domestic policy coherence with your international policy, and you're not thinking about the effects of technology or changing consumer preferences. I understand there's a press person here. Do you mind raising your hand? Okay. Would you say your market has changed significantly in the last 20 years?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And it's probably not import competition. It's just lots of fragmentation and anybody now can write a press piece and try to get it published, and so you're competing with more potential providers. I don't know. I think your labor market has changed largely because of underlying technology changes. Okay. Now, if you want to talk about it afterwards, happy to debate it. But lots of reasons that these things are changing, and not very good policy responses in some parts of the world. I spend a lot of time in China, and they don't like it that I bring this up to them frequently, that China, you are going to face in the next 15 years very significant changes in your economy that are likely to stress your domestic institutions, okay? And that's technology. China's very hot on AI, right? Are you supplying the right kind of labor to work in that kind of economy? What's going to happen when steel and automobiles are largely automated? It's currently a real challenge to fully automate automobiles, but likely to be overcome in the next few years. What are you going to do with all those workers? Or their kids who are going to be looking for those kinds of jobs if they don't get different kinds of skill sets. So I would argue that many of our trade models have tried to keep up with some of these different margins of adjustment. So, our typical trade models were okay with countries and sectors, get beyond 2 by 2 in some models, and that's hard, but we generally dealt with that. We've done a good job with firms, things like the Mellitz model. We start to be able to look at the fact that not all firms are the same. And we can build in households and factors by labor type and different kinds of capital. But we really haven't done a good job of exploiting insights in our models that can tell us. And let me just tell you, for many years in the US government, I tried to get US policymakers to look at regional effects of trade agreements, because we did research and showed that they were heterogeneous. Okay? We tried to get them to look at different kinds of labor, because we saw that there were heterogeneous effects. And we tried to get them to look at the different effects on households, because we saw that there were different effects on the income side and the expenditure side. And depending on what kind of household you were, you could be differently affected. And policymakers did not want to hear it. So, it's very important. We economists do have tools. We are challenged. We need to do a better job of this, particularly around the regional drivers of inequality. That's been a big thing in the United States. I think it's a fairly big thing in Germany. And we have to understand how households and different kinds of labor are affected. But if we economists generate those insights, we've also got to make sure that the general public hear about them and that policymakers care about them. I would argue that in the United States, what policymakers wanted is, what's the positive effect of a trade agreement? And gee, can you make that number bigger? Okay, and we said, no, we're not going to make the number any bigger. The number is what the number is. And I'm pretty confident we did a reasonable job on that, okay, at the marginal effect of the trade agreement. But you need to understand that there's these distributional effects, and not everybody is happy about it, and that you should take some of those gains and make sure that you use them to help with the adjustments. So, by the way, this is an analysis that we did when I was at the USITC on the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and this is the quantity impact and revenue impact on different sectors. And you can see that we were telling them that there would be some sectors that gained and some sectors that lost, okay? And that there'd be some sectors where employment increased and some that decreased. And we can play with the labor closure, and we could do lots of different things there and provide a range of results. And we did some of that, and there was not a lot of interest, okay? I'm being somewhat defensive here as an economist who works in trade, that lots of people blame economists for not really telling the truth in this and arguing simplistic arguments. But almost every academic paper that you read recognizes these things, okay? And almost any high quality either government or research institution will show you that there are this distribution of effects. It's not something that's new to us. It goes way back in theory. But not account, this is a graph from Otto, Dorn, and Hansen, which I want to emphasize is partial equilibrium. Okay, it's not general equilibrium, but they argue that, you know, because of the China effect, that there were some, I can't even remember the number now. I should, because I've had to deal with it for so many years. Either about 20% of manufacturing unemployment was a result of Chinese import competition affecting the distribution of production in the U.S. And the interesting thing is they tried to account for technological change, but they also accounted for the knock-on effects, not general equilibrium knock-on effects, but the knock-on effects that if a factory shut down in a commuting district, that would have impacts on, you know, restaurants, clothing stores, any other economic activity that might be related to the incomes generated from that manufacturing. And so the effects get bigger, okay? The effects get bigger. But what Otto, Dorn, and Hansen doesn't do is then calculate what the positive effects of imports are, because those imports also generated a fair amount of jobs in different sectors of the economy and in different parts of the U.S. economy. So,
It's on commuting zones? That's not counties?
no, commuting zones is yeah, commuting zones.
That's bigger if
Could be bigger or smaller. It depends on how the Department of Commerce defines their standard statistical metropolitan measures. Now, this is some work by Jens Swedekam and other authors. I think he wasn't actually the first author, but he came to the WTO to talk about it, so I'll put his name on the paper. But he also showed that in Germany, that highly import-exposed regions did not anywhere near as well as the highly exported regions. And I would argue that as a challenge for us economists, that we have to recognize that economic geography is very important and that trade interacts with economic geography in many complex ways. And when we do the unit of analysis as just the country, we're forgetting about the underlying political economy, as well as forgetting that lots of consumers getting cheap iPhones, they're not necessarily going to recognize the benefit of trade as much as, say, the dishwasher assembly guy who lost his job because Samsung dishwashers were imported at a cheaper price and took his job away, or the manufacturer shifted a lot of the manufacturing down to Mexico. Okay? So those concentrated losses among a few people will generate much more political effect than the widely distributed gains from trade. And then one could argue that perhaps capital owners have done much better than workers, but then how you sort that out from technological change is also very important. Or, in the United States, a concerted effort to undermine labor unions, okay, and to reduce their influence as a labor market institution on the outcomes in the United States. All right. So what does the future hold? I really don't know. Other than it's likely to be very different. But how different might it look? So a few years ago, the government of China worked with the World Bank to look at China in 2035, I think. I think it was China 2035. And I have to say, if any government is likely to plan an outcome and achieve many of the elements in that planned outcome, it's probably the Chinese government. Okay? Now, there may be all sorts of secondary and tertiary effects that aren't included in their targets, but if they say that they're going to shift from investment-led to consumption-led, they're probably going to bring that about. And we already see that happening. You see rebalancing already. If they say that they're going to have more services consumed than currently, and that manufacturing share in the domestic economy is going to decline, I think they're going to achieve that. Okay? So a couple of colleagues and I basically took this World Bank, I think it was the NDRC or just the DRC in China. We took their scenarios and we put it into a global trade model and made it dynamic. And we assumed that the rest of the world was pretty plain vanilla. That, you know, it hit its GDP targets and, well, that it hit its projected GDP numbers, and that the underlying comparative advantage in the global economy didn't change very much, but that China's did. Now, that assumption that the underlying change in comparative advantage in the global economy, I can tell you, is wrong, and it's one of the things that we're trying to do in this update for our forthcoming World Trade Report. A lot of research out there now has told us that comparative advantage has a cycle of about 16 years, okay, and that it's fairly dynamic. So a country's comparative advantage changes, and the distribution of comparative advantage can change pretty significantly. That's what we've observed out of Asia, okay, is a big change in comparative advantage. And it's had pretty big global impacts, and I would argue that between technology and government policy, we're going to see changes in comparative advantage down the line. But we just isolated the effect of China's change in comparative advantage and just assume the rest of the world kind of goes along plain vanilla. So what do we get? So GDP, wait a second. I'm sorry, I'm not there yet. This is a different slide. We did a similar kind of study at the WTO in 2013. It was before I arrived, but I have to say that the inspiration for the study came from a conference I held in Shanghai in 2011, where they built a model to look at future trade scenarios, but their focus was, you know, let's look at various scenarios for demographic growth, investment growth, not really changing comparative advantage, but just some of the fundamental basic drivers of economic growth. So capital accumulation, those kinds of things. And they had high and low scenario, and the blue line is the developed high scenario, and the red line is the developed low scenario in this quarter panel. In this quarter panel, it's the developing high scenario, and this is GDP and exports. So this is GDP, and this is exports down here. So this is developed and developing, GDP and exports. And if you look, you see that fast growth is very, very important for developing country exports. And they eventually become by far the largest global exporters. And this is by 2028 there. The green lines, can you see the green lines? It's maybe hard to see because they're largely on the red lines, the low growth scenario. Except here for developing country exports where they're somewhere in the middle. The green line is what's actually happened. Okay? So we did this work. The scenarios were actually run in about 2012, I think. And, 2012. And we were in a low growth trade scenario, and that's exactly it. Our scenarios from this underlying model, which we did with CEPI and Paris, did a pretty good job of capturing that low growth scenario. The only place we were off is developing countries did a little bit better in exports than we expected given the low growth scenario. All right, so this is just trying to tell you that these kinds of projections can work reasonably well. Okay? Some folks suggest that the next 35 years will definitely look different than the past 35 years. This is a scenario on 3D printing on world trade in goods and services. So this group, I think it was Oxford Economics, basically says that if 3D printing has deep penetration and quickly, that we're going to see a very fast fall off in global trade growth in goods and services as data flows much faster than goods and services. If there's slow penetration, then instead of trade growth, like in this previous, you see how it's rising fast here, right? Instead of rising fast, it'll rise much slower. Now we think, and this is something we're going to examine in our forthcoming World Trade Report, just how big is digitally enabled technology? What's the impact going to be on the physical movement of goods and services? In that work that we did with CEPI, that's not in there. There's technological change, but not this kind of technological change, okay? And in the work that I did on China into the future, we don't have that kind of technological change. We're building that in right now and looking at changing comparative advantage as well as increasing digital intensity. So looking at a simpler model, we basically took this scenario, which was the World Bank DRC scenario around what happens to China's savings, big decline there, okay? Private consumption, instead of declining as it did between 1978 and say 2014, I think that was, it's supposed to increase. Government consumption was pretty stable. We think it's going to increase as social safety net spending increases. And then investment is going to decline and the current account balance will decline. But they didn't specify how that was going to work through the global economy. And then down here in terms of the composition, agriculture will continue its decline. We see that globally, right? Industry, instead of growing really, really fast, will experience a decline. And then services, which have been growing fast, will continue to grow fast. Okay? So if there's no change, well, let's see. So this is, if there's no change, no policy intervention, so China just let the economy go on sort of a path without trying to do this rebalancing, and the economy looked very much like it did in the past. It may not, by the way, right? But if it just stayed looking like it did in the past, this would be real private household consumption in China. But with the policy changes, this is the path. So it rises very fast. And it's distributed, and I won't go into all the details here, but it's distributed across these sectors. And the red bars show the rate of growth, and you can see that in retail trade, there's very rapid growth. So consumers are buying a lot more regular products. They're buying many more business services, a lot more education and health, a lot more housing, a lot more financial services, communication, transportation. So that was the big effect in terms of consumers buying services, but they also increased pretty dramatically a lot of their manufacturing consumption. Sorry about that. And interestingly, as their consumption of manufacturing is going up, their manufacturing is going down. So I don't show you the manufacturing. But how does that work through in terms of trade balances? Well, China's essentially down the line in this scenario would become a trade deficit country. Okay, China's net exports to the world would drop pretty significantly. China's net exports to the US would drop to about 0. Sorry. To the EU, big deficit. So there's a rebalancing here with the US as a result of the policy change, if nothing else were changing, right? Okay, I mean, it's changing, but in a very plain vanilla way. But the biggest drivers are that it becomes a big deficit country with the EU, Japan, and Korea. Now, I've presented this in China, and the reaction is, no way. We continue to be a surplus economy. And I'm not trying to say that this is a prediction. These are the underlying forces that would play out in this model that we built, okay? Focusing on how the changing structure of the Chinese economy might interplay with a relatively generic, not significantly changing rest of the world. Now, what we're doing in our current effort is we're taking a shot at how the rest of the world might change. Key players, the EU, the United States, Japan, Australia, Canada, big players. We're going to ask questions about how might their economies evolve. And that will, I think, get a much more interesting answer. Then the objective of the project is to ask EU experts, what do you think about our projection for the EU? US experts, what do you think about our projection for the United States? What would you change? And I know, because we used to do this for the United States, that we would consult with industry experts and they would tell us what they thought would happen, and then we'd try to reconcile that within an economic model. And we'd get a pretty good shot. We'd get a pretty good insight as to how particularly the underlying technology in the US economy would change. The hardest thing to predict was consumer behavior. Okay? So you really don't know what consumers are going to do in the future. But we could at least get one side right, and then we could do some scenarios around changing consumer preferences. I'll skip that, but that's just, this is just trying to illustrate here, well, this is how comparative advantage can change, okay? If you remember your basic microeconomics, your production possibility frontier changes, shifts out, but this is happening in every country all the time, right? Not always shifting out, by the way, sometimes shifting backwards if there's bad, if you have negative economic growth. But rarely does it look like this. I would argue rarely is it that the world just kind of shifts out blandly, although that's our assumption for the rest of the world in that China stuff, while China has shifts like this, okay? And then why is it hard to sort out the differences between technological change and trade? I mean, again, this is sort of standard trade theory. The production possibility frontier, which is a technological change, can get you to that higher consumption, get you to higher consumption levels, this indifference curve, but so can trade. And then sorting out whether you're at point C or this point here can be very difficult to determine. So we often have a very hard time sorting out the effects of trade versus technology. I'm not going to talk about this. I think I'm probably talked pretty close to enough. David Autor, by the way, has done some very good work on labor markets, just looking at what are some of the factors that could affect labor market evolution in the future. And if you're not familiar with his work and you're only familiar with the controversial work around trade, I highly recommend that you go look at some of his very accessible papers. I think he did a nice piece in the Journal of Economic Perspectives looking at sort of the different complementarity and substitution effects between labor and technology. And I highly recommend you take a look at that. It's really informing us in terms of how we model our labor markets going forward and what how to translate some of these scenarios through to labor market effects. And I want to reiterate, it's very, very hard as an economist to do these things and accurately predict the future. What these models help you do is sort out the different kinds of factors that you ought to be looking at and perhaps monitoring and trying to make sure that you're getting them right in your analysis. If you're not doing that kind of work in a simulation model in particular, or not accounting for it in an empirical model, it's likely that you're missing something. It's likely that you're missing something, and that something can be very important. All right. We did a joint piece last year with the IMF and the World Bank, basically encouraging G20 member countries, based on our underlying work on projections, assessment of trade policy, and macroeconomic effects on trade. And our job in these international organizations is not to dictate policy, although some international organizations perhaps do that more than we do. At the WTO, we're just the secretariat that helps advise members on potential policy choices. And I try to give them, as I said, forward-looking advice, not just looking in the rearview mirror. But, you know, you've really got to pay attention to the various factors. And I am from the United States, and I have to say that I find the debate in the United States in the last, I don't know, last 5 or 6 years, not just with the recent administration, has not been particularly well informed. Okay, the debate has been very narrow and fragmented and really hasn't reflected, I think, a deep understanding of the various forces at play and the kinds of policy responses that you might need. So things like there's a trade adjustment mechanism in the United States called Trade Adjustment Assistance, which has been in place for many years. It's very small. It has some positive effect, but it's not very big. And if you've lost your job because of technological change, it doesn't help you. If you've lost your job because of changing consumer preferences, it doesn't help you, right? So, it doesn't help those newspaper printer press operator guys with the decline in printed newspapers. It doesn't help reporters deal with the changing technology in the labor market. I don't know, in Germany, have you had a big shakeout in your retail sectors as a result of online purchasing? Yeah. In the United States, there was this big electronics retailer called Circuit City. It went out of business, right? Kmart is going out of business. Sears is likely to go out of business. Those people don't get any kind of special adjustment, even though that's a combination of technology and preferences changing. Got nothing to do with trade. Nothing to do with trade. And there's far more people working in the non-tradable sector than in the traded sector. And so you've got to have policies that try to take this into account and reflect different kinds of adjustment, competitiveness forces, and compensation policies. Often we would argue, look at, each country has its own circumstances and needs to adapt its policy circumstances to its culture, to its policy setting, to its political setting. But please have a broad view. Don't focus narrowly on any one particular factor. And if you want to maintain public support for economic change, it's very likely that you need some institutions. I don't want to say that those institutions have to be government. They might be non-governmental institutions. I think in Germany, there's a special relationship between firms and workers. Is that right? Generally, where they have to sit down and kind of negotiate. That's not the way it is in the United States. It's not the way it is in China. It's not the way it is in Korea. And I'm not suggesting that the German model is the right one. People often look at Denmark and Sweden and Norway. They have particular circumstances where their policies work. But you can think about non-governmental and governmental solutions that help have people engage more broadly in how you manage economic change. I'm actually, as part of the G20, I'm the WTO rep to the Trade and Investment Working Group, but I've been involved recently with the T20, the think tank 20. Is CES, EFO in that? Yeah? No? Okay. And working with Dennis Snower, who's located here in Germany. Kiel, right. What is it, the Institute for World Economy? Yeah. And, you know, the goal is to try to have this broader thinking, not just look at one particular aspect, and also understand that there are sociological aspects, not just economic aspects. All right, with that touchy-feely stuff, I'll close and open it up for questions. Thank you.